Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this fifth meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2026, I'll get it right. We've received apologies from Monica Lennon, and I welcome Sarah Boyack to the meeting as the substitute member. I also welcome to the meeting Sue Webber, who will have an opportunity to ask questions in our evidence sessions once the committee members have asked theirs. Our first item of business today is a decision on taking items 8 and 9 in private. Item 8 is consideration of today's evidence on the draft climate change plan, and item 9 is consideration of today's evidence on the Scottish Government's budget. Are we agreed to take these items in private? We are agreed. Item 2 is an evidence session on the Scottish Government's draft climate change plan. This sets out how the Scottish Government intends to meet its carbon emission reduction targets. The committee is leading a cross-committee effort to scrutinise the draft plan. The Scottish Government said it will lay a final plan by the end of March. Today's session will focus on the transport aspects of the draft plan, and I welcome Fiona Hislop, the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Philip Rains, the Deputy Director for Domestic Climate Change from the Scottish Government, Morna Cannon, the Director of the Environment, Climate and Sustainability Transport Scotland, and Heather Cowan, Head of Climate Change and Just Transition for Transport from Transport Scotland. Thank you for all attending this morning. And Cabinet Secretary, I think you want to make a brief opening statement. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Committee. Thank you for the invitation to today's session to give evidence on the draft climate change plan, which sets out the actions that must be taken by 2040 to reduce emissions and meet Scotland's first 3 statutory carbon budgets. Now, as the Cabinet Secretary responsible for transport, I'll discuss the transport's contribution to the draft Climate Change Plan CCP, and as Scotland's largest emitting sector, accounting for around a third of Scottish net emissions in 2023, decarbonising the transport sector is critical to achieving our carbon budgets. And as set out in the draft Climate Change Plan, transport is expected to deliver a substantial share of the emissions reductions over the next decade. Now, we can take encouragement from the fact that key technologies for transport decarbonisation, such as electrification, are already here and improving all the time, but nonetheless, substantial action will be required to deliver the transport emission reductions envisaged in the plan, and I want to be clear that we will deliver this in a way that is fair and part of a just transition. Now, transport is particularly a challenging sector to decarbonise because it's so woven into lots of different parts of people's lives. It's shaped by how people live, work, learn and access goods and services. So decarbonising the sector will require the transformation of our economy and society, underpinned by sustained investment, both public and private, in physical infrastructure. And it will also mean government supporting people, communities and businesses to make more sustainable choices. Now, that's why public involvement and engagement are essential. Delivering a just transition to net zero by 2045 will rely on action from government, businesses and households alike. And I look forward to considering in further detail the consultation responses and the reflections on transport within them as part of the finalisation of the climate change plan. And I also welcome the valuable scrutiny and input from that this committee provides. Now, the draft climate change plan builds on progress we're making in the transport sector. It includes 28 actions for the transport sector, including measures that support modal shift through more sustainable forms of travel, as well as measures to encourage a more rapid transition to electric vehicles. Now, since the draft plan was published, we've continued to progress the delivery of policies that support these priorities. We've committed nearly £1.4 billion across the spending review period to low carbon and sustainable travel, including active travel, bus infrastructure and support for zero emission vehicles. We recognise the importance of multi-year funding, particularly for infrastructure projects, and we're committed to providing as much certainty as possible while ensuring our public finances remain on a sustainable footing. The Scottish Government will introduce an air departure tax on the 1st of April 2027, matching the UK Government's air passenger duty rates and bans in the first year. We will then go further and introduce a private jet supplement within the air departure tax from 2028 to 2029. And we believe that those who choose to use private jets should pay higher rates of tax if they choose not to change that behaviour. And this is in line with the polluter pays principle and our progressive approach to taxation. And while we remain firmly committed to delivering net zero, delivering transport's contribution in the CCP, it also depends on actions from across society, from businesses, householders, commercial investors and from local authorities as well. And the draft CCP is rightly ambitious on the scale of emissions reductions required from cars and vans. So reaching these ambitions will require a continued joint commitment from us to align national action with local authorities' commitment to accelerated programmes of public EV charging rollout, supporting cross-pavement charging and investing in projects which enable people to leave their cars behind. And we also need the UK Government to play its part too, especially by using its reserve powers to ensure swift strategic upgrades in electricity networks and swifter connections, to work collaboratively with devolved governments on regulatory approaches to phasing out fossil-fuelled technologies and to making public charging more affordable. And we also continue to urge the UK Government to take a four-nations approach to broader motoring tax reform in a way that balances support for electric vehicle uptake and car use reduction. And critically, we need the UK Government to provide consistent signals about the transition to net zero transport. So recent decisions on policies such as the Vehicle Emission Trading Scheme and pay-per-mile charges on electric cars undermine the clarity and confidence people need to take action. So we ask that devolved nations are included at an early stage in the development of policies for all transport decarbonisations. So I look forward to discussing the draft climate change plan with the committee today, which I believe sets out a strong, ambitious pathway for transport's contribution to achieving our first 3 carbon budgets. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. It seems I get the first question. So the first question is a huge amount of this plan, as far as transport concerned, is based on getting the EV vehicles on the road. Do you think those targets that you've been set out are deliverable? And what are you going to do if they're not delivered, Cabinet Secretary?
So clearly we've got statutory carbon budgets, and that's obviously the requirement in law for us to achieve them over the 3 different periods. Clearly we will track the delivery of that, and obviously if that is off course, that would need adjustments, and the way that the legislation is established and the way we need to approach this, it would mean we would need to adapt our policies to achieve the targets either within transport but across the other different sectors, and that's what that adjustment would be. In terms of whether I think we can do this, well, we're in line with what the Climate Change Committee say itself in terms of we have got some differences, which is why transport has more of a focus than other sectors within our draft climate change plan. But generally, the advice is that they anticipate there'll be far more of a shift from ICE vehicles to electric vehicles as part of the transition than they previously had thought. That's also reflected in ours and our proposals, which means there needs to be a rapid uptake of EV cars and vans in particular, because that's the biggest area, but also within the plan. And importantly, we need to tackle and support the HGV sector to make sure that heavy goods vehicles and others in that sector can start that process, which is already happening, but starting that process, and also working with private investors and others to do that. But I think if you were to say what characterises the draft climate change plan, as you quite correctly identifies, it anticipates a far bigger take-up of electric vehicles than was previously thought. There's more of a balance on shift to EV vehicles. There's still a requirement for car use reduction, and car use reduction is beneficial in lots of other different ways as well. But there's less of an emphasis on that and more of an emphasis on EV vehicles. That gives particular challenges to Scotland. We know we have an extensive rural area, great reliance on cars. So therefore, within the budget, we've got specific measures, particularly which we've already started rolling out on rural and islands, for islands infrastructure for EV charging in particular. And finally, because it's an opening question, I suppose it's the context of it. And that is why a lot of the things we have to do, we have to move smartly and quickly on now in order to meet the reductions that will be anticipated and projected at some point in the future.
Okay, I'm going to park HGVs, if you'll excuse the expression, because we're going to get to them later. But let's talk about EVs as far as cars and vans are concerned. You've told me what the problems are. You haven't filled me with confidence that we're going to achieve them. And you haven't told me what you're going to do if you don't achieve them. So if you don't achieve the EV change to EVs, how are you going to make up the shortfall when it appears we're not going to reach the target? Which other area of transport are going to get hit, as it were, to make up the difference?
So I'm not responsible for how you feel about whether I give you confidence or not, but I can tell you from the government's point of view, we've set out a plan that is realistic, that can be delivered, and with the incentivisation which will be required, further incentivisation than the UK is already providing. You know there's a discount for EV purchases from the UK government. What we'll be doing and what's funded in here, and there's over £220 million for that in order for us to start a kind of major shift in encouraging people to take up EVs. We need to give them confidence with the EV charging structure, which is why we've got one of the most extensive EV charging structure already outside of the south of England, where the UK government have put in measures in terms of regulations for reliability, and there'll be penalties if there's not reliability of those EV chargers in the future, and also in terms of, as I've said, our biggest challenge will be rural and islands infrastructure. We've already launched, and it's been taken up very widely, £4 million this year for rural and islands infrastructure funding, and we've got £10 million in the next year to ramp that up even further because we know the intake. So are we putting measures in place that will help that? Can I tell you the detail of the actual programmes for the incentivisation in terms of EV take-up? We're looking at that directly just now. We think we need to have measures that complements the discount from the UK government, but there will absolutely be measures in there as well. The cross-pavement charging, I know that's an issue that's been of much interest to the committee previously. We've had 3 local authorities taking up the pilot. We'll have the draft guidances now with local authorities and their transport directors to review just now. That's to be published early 2026. So are the measures being put in place that would help that? Yes. If there was adjustments that needed to be taken, probably adjustments will be more on the behavioural side of things rather than the actual physical take-up of cars. That would probably be an adjustment you would have to take if you weren't achieving your targets on EV take-up. Is EV take-up reflecting what is required? And are we, for example, with the zero-emission mandates, reflecting what's required? That's the single biggest thing that will make the shift. And that's actually, we're part of a 4-nation agreement with the UK government on that, but the vehicle emission trading scheme and the zero emission mandates will be the single biggest thing that will have the shift that you're requiring. So you're asking me, do I have confidence in what's put forward? Perhaps, I don't know whether that means you don't have confidence in what the previous United Kingdom government had done in terms of setting those targets or not, but that's up to you to reflect what you feel about that. All I'm saying is that there are measures in place that can deliver to that. We have a legal responsibility, should they not be met, to adjust somewhere else, and that's what we would do. Within transport, you'd probably get a shift more on the behavioural side, but obviously across government, we'd have to assess what's happening in housing and agriculture. In other words, as you'll know from the evidence sessions that you've taken today.
And in fairness, Cabinet Secretary, I'm trying to drill down on whether I can have confidence, and my lack of confidence is perhaps sparked by the fact that the Scottish Government failed to meet its climate change targets and had to adjust the climate change plan, which we should have been considering over 18 months ago, but we're now in the position that we're doing it at the back end of this Parliament. So we'll just park that one there for the moment. Just come back to me and explain to me the consumer incentives to encourage EV take-up. You're saying that you're talking about it, you're thinking about it. What's it going to cost, and what are your proposals? Is it to give everyone some money to buy an EV, or subsidise them? How much?
So I would make the point that the climate change targets we've had previously were actually the Parliament's climate change targets, and indeed the extended targets that were put there were put as a result of pressure from opposition parties to get there. But we are where we are, and I can understand that you'd have wanted this earlier. I understand that, absolutely. But in terms of what that means in terms of incentives, so one of the things that would be sensible to do would be to to make sure that all the incentives are on offer are complementary. So we know that there's a over £3,000 discount from the UK government currently for purchase of EV cars. They're currently having an advertising campaign to help promote that. We're also embarking on promotion of EV take-up. Part of that will obviously be the cost side, because obviously that is one of the kind of benefits to people if they can afford to get a car in the first place, what they can do in terms of saving, in terms of the costs they have at the petrol pump, and making sure that's clear to people is really important. One of the big challenges is, I think, is in terms of affordability for those that perhaps may not be able to buy an EV car new. So that's another sector that's yet to be developed. We have had previously loans to encourage people to buy EV cars, and latterly that's been more in the second-hand market and also for vans. So one of the things we've been doing with our work with the Energy Saving Trust was to try and target EV take-up and those that perhaps wouldn't be able to afford an EV car new, but might be able to do it in a second-hand area. We've just secured the budget. So what I'm saying, one of the things that you obviously want me to do is, well, first is what you're going to do and how you're going to pay for it. Can I say it's also a chicken and egg that you also have to have the funds enabled to deliver what you want to deliver. But we've secured funding that will help us in terms of that area. There are other areas that obviously help encourage zero reduction in emissions, and one of the areas, for example, is going to be on the bus infrastructure fund, which I know you've taken a clear in for. But consumer incentives will be the vast majority of what we'll be doing, but we'll need to target in different areas. I think I've yet to have the advice from that, so I'm not going to tell you what we are going to do. But whether it's going to be on subsidy in terms of take-up, second-hand, I think is a particular market we need to be looking at. We also have to look at what the private market itself is doing and not necessarily have displacement from government on that. In the past, we've had, for example, for taxis, when we were in different areas, scrappage schemes that help reduce costs, etc. So there's a whole variety of different things which we will be bringing forward, the government will be bringing forward, and we've just secured the funding for that. I am confident we've got funding that will help us to do that from the budget and the spending review. And as I said, we need to move pretty quickly on the transport side of things. So unless I've got colleagues want to add anything.
Cabinet Secretary, can I just drill down, because I love figures and I love looking at figures and finances. So in the case of a second-hand electric vehicle market, could you just explain to me what the government thinks is a reasonable price for households to pay, considering there's a cost of living crisis for an electric vehicle, and how they will get to that figure? Will they make up the difference from that price and what it actually costs at the market at the moment to buy that vehicle?
Right. You might like figures. I've not got figures to hand that will give you an illustrative amount for that for different types of families and their income. One of the challenges we've had, in particular in relation to loans, is income levels being able to sustain the credit ratings that's required for purchase if it's on a loan basis. And that's one of the areas that I think we need to address. So therefore, there has to be different means for doing that. So part of that is to make sure that for people moving to, and this is obviously what the UK government has had to think about in relation to the previous Conservative government, and now the current Labour government, is in having the targets that they have in relation to not selling new, and I'll emphasise that. That's what the schemes are set up, is to reduce new purchase. So therefore, the new purchases will end. So therefore, there'll be more of a premium, I think, and there already is starting in the second-hand area. And it's trying to get you're correct, is what would be the sweet spot of affordability for families, and also the costs of that second-hand car. And also, if the second-hand car market can develop, it would also give more confidence to those that are buying first and new, because they know they've got a resale price on it. I'm sure if you spoke to many of the car dealerships, they can give you average prices currently, but we are seeing the cost of EV cars generally coming down, and for many, if they're on a payment price, for new ones, it's not too dissimilar. The issue is, how do you get it more available for more people on lower incomes to be able to switch to EVs? Okay,
so just very briefly, to get to where we want to be on electric vehicles, the government must have considered how many electric vehicles need to be bought across Scotland. And to achieve that target, they must have worked out what people will be able to afford and what the i.e. so we'll understand what the uptake will be. What concerns me is we have an aspiration, which I might sign up to on EV vehicles, but no way of financially making it achievable for those people who are being targeted to buy the EV vehicles because they just don't have the money. So have you worked out, I'm trying to work out if you've worked that out.
Could I bring in Morna Cannon, if that's okay?
Thank you, Convener. I would perhaps just first say that in terms of the prices of electric vehicles, we are seeing really encouraging movement on those prices in the marketplace. So, for instance, we've seen evidence that 1/3 of used cars in the marketplace are now under £20,000 purchase price. And indeed, there are some very cheap new electric vehicles on the marketplace. I think the cheapest on the market at the moment is around £12,000. So that is encouraging. We are, as the Cabinet Secretary has alluded to, we are in line with the CCC's assumptions on the pathway for reduction for decarbonising vehicles, for cars and vans. And we have in mind a draft target to reduce emissions from cars in line with that pathway. And that target is to reduce emissions from to at least 16% from today's levels. And that equates to 90% of all new car sales being electric. So there has been some assessment of the volume of sales required, and as Cabinet Secretary suggests, further details being developed in terms of the consumer incentives to align with that pathway.
Well, that's helpful. I'm trying to get the Cabinet Secretary to tell me what the incentives will be. Will it be, a percentage of the purchase price? I mean, £12,000 might seem cheap, but to a lot of people that's unobtainable, and they don't have those sort of resources.
Which is why that's exactly what we're going to be doing, is modelling what those incentives will look like. I've just secured the budget, we've just secured a spending review, we've now got the draft climate change plan. We know in terms of aligning those that the big focus will have to be on EV incentives, which is why we've got, this was, in terms of the budget, the substantial amount of funding that is precisely for this area of policy, not just for cars and vans, but for other modes as well.
Okay, I hear that as somebody interested in financials. If you secure the budget, you must know whether it's going to be sufficient to achieve the target. And we'll just leave that there, because otherwise I could take up the whole session on this, and that would be wrong. And Douglas, I think you want to come in now on one or two other points.
Thank you, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, you announced a commitment in April 24 to deliver 24,000 new EV charge points by 2030. Can you give us an update of where the government is with that?
So we're currently at 7,400 public charge points. That's obviously 2 years ahead of target. In terms of the expansion of that, you'll know that we've rolled out the £30 million to all the different local authorities consortium. The last one was to be announced was the Edinburgh South East of Scotland one. You'll also be aware that there's a significant amount of private funding going into the public charging network right across Scotland. And so, the last figure showed that in the last year, probably the estimates were around about 45 million to 50 million from the private sector. And so increasingly, you've got privately funded and run public charging networks developing all over. So in terms of the growth and rollout of that, that is expansive, and we do know that that will certainly help deliver that 24,000. The 24,000 themselves is an interesting figure, because we set that because that was what previously the Climate Change Committee had said. That's absolutely, that's what you need, and it was I think it was it was a percentage of what they were saying for the whole of the UK. I did have a meeting with a subcommittee of the UK Climate Change Committee and asked them about this, saying that's obviously, it's quite a big figure, challenging figure. They were less concerned about the amount, it was more about the location. And for Scotland in particular, it's the location, which is why the Rural Infrastructure and Islands Infrastructure Fund, which is for EV charging, is so important. So, the £4 million that we put out in this financial year has been taken up right from the borders, right up to the north of Scotland and Islands. And because it is so important and so successful, and we're more advanced in that, in terms of, the delivery of it, we've got £10 million in the budget to ensure that we can roll that out even further. So in terms of the availability, and I was up at Holkirk, that's one of the furthest north in terms of the availability of EV charging publicly. I was there over the summer. Obviously, people want to ensure there's public charging where they need it to be, but it's increasingly being delivered by the private sector. And again, where the market failure might be in that is where we need to, as government, I think we need to step away from doing the investment with the local authorities. That's well in its track. They need to then start delivering on it. But I do think we need to ensure that we're tackling the areas that perhaps might not get the private funding.
I think you probably predicted where I was going, Cabinet Secretary, that I think in cities it's obviously going to be a lot easier, but when you actually go to rural areas and also trunk roads as well, what's the strategy that you have to actually ensure that the funding goes to those places that probably are the harder to reach places, rather than cities where I would imagine if you're a private investor, you're more likely to invest where the bit larger concentration of people are. So how's the government making sure that that funding is more targeted to where it's actually needed?
That's why we have the Rural and Islands Infrastructure Fund in particular, and the mapping of what's needed and where that need might be. There's also location charging. So one of the things, and if you take, for example, even on the tourist market that's going into the rural Scotland, encouraging and working with destinations to have charging so that people can pick up their EV car at the airport, go and charge wherever they want to go in terms of their visits in different areas. So that's a target. Small B&Bs, etc., or places that would want to encourage people to come and have EV charging. The eligibility criteria might be there for them as well in terms of what we can do with the rural and islands infrastructure. You're talking about trunk roads, so there's one about the kind of more dispersed areas where people might go. On trunk roads, I think the issue is when people are travelling, will they want to come off to be provided for? If you take Dundee, for example, there's numerous privately funded public charging networks, along with Costas, etc. You're seeing that increasingly. A lot of the areas tend to be, because you'd have to, there's a bit about wait, have a coffee. So increasingly, there's one near Glasgow Airport that I opened, where it's it's a site where you'll have your Costa coffee. They tend to be shopping, shopping centres, areas that are just off a trunk road. You've got those areas. I think the interesting thing, and I frequently get asked about the A9, but obviously originally the A9, it was not to have service stations on the A9, and that was to ensure people can go into the streets and go into the neighbouring towns. If you were to map the availability of EV charging on the A9 corridor, and I'm not saying on the A9 itself, but into Pitlochry or Dunkeld or whatever, there's a good mapping which we can provide the committee of where they are. In terms of if you want to have a Costa stroke kind of charging off a trunk road, clearly that's market led. That's not something that we as a government set up, because obviously that would be a private initiative. So we're open to that, but that would be up to the local those that are interested in that market opportunity, speaking to the local authority for the planning for that area, and obviously with local landowners to obviously then have a proposition. But what I was going to say is, when you talk particularly to those that are travelling A9 regularly, and particularly those that are in freight, they would tend to charge before and after, and it's range. So that becomes has the range got to such extent you can do Perth to Inverness comfortably. And I think that's the bit where it depends what car you've got, what range you've got. But there's a market solution to be had there, and certainly with all the activity and the work that's taking place. But that's something where where is it that the government should step in and where does the private sector step in? We think the rural and islands infrastructure is the emphasis, but I think there's an open door should anybody want to approach local authorities to develop on, as they have done in cities, but more so on trunk road corridors.
So back to the target of 24,000. So you said you were at 7,400 just now. So are you confident that that target will be reached by 2030? Or are you more relaxed that we maybe, I think as you said from the Climate Change Committee, that's maybe a target that doesn't need to be met? I wasn't quite clear on that.
That was more the impression I got from them. But we're of all the different areas that we're going into, I'm more confident about this area because you can see it and it's happening and the trajectory. I do think we need to put as much focus on location as per volume, if that makes sense. Whereas previously, I think it was all about the numbers, and we're doing well with the numbers. That's progressing. I feel reasonably comfortable and confident about that. But actually, the biggest challenge for Scotland is going to be the location.
Other question I had was, you said earlier, Cabinet Secretary, that public charging needs to be more affordable. I completely agree. If you're lucky enough to have a charger at home, you might pay 9 pence per kilowatt hour. If you have to use a fast charger, you may be paying 10 times that amount. And you mentioned the cross pavement solution, which is fine for some people, but if you don't have if you live in a tenement block, for example, that's not going to be an option available to you. So how do we get into a situation where it is actually affordable for all, and there's not an equality gap, whether you're, if you're in a fortunate situation to have your own driveway, you'll be paying a far reduced amount than if you have to rely on public charging, you may be paying a lot more.
Touch on something that's really important, which is the equity in the system, and in terms of transition is affordability for everybody, and I think that's the challenge. In terms of the cross pavement charging, which is the pilot for that in the 3 local authorities is doing well. It's helping us inform the advice and guidance that will come to all local authorities, informed by those that know best, which is the Scots, the organisation of lead transport directors in each local authority. So that guidance is in draft. It's going around with all the local authorities for feedback. We're expecting that to be published soon, which will enable everybody else to take that up and be comfortable that that's been researched and it's also informed from the pilots. We're not being product specific. I think in the rest of the UK there's more, or particularly in England, I think there's more of a restriction as to what products can be used. Ours is, apart from the main issue is to make sure there's no trip hazards or basics that you would expect. And there's also funding extended again into the budget for cross-pavement rollout as well. So that should be helpful. But your point about, I think the biggest challenge is going to be cities and flats, etc. And that, again, there's an issue there around factoring and then responsibilities and what can be done there. And I think that's going to be the next key challenge is how do we ensure that can be done in some cities. You will see public charging that will be in each street to enable people to use that, and that would be the sensible way forward for many. But you need to find the physical infrastructure ways of doing that, and that itself, as you said, will help reduce the cost because obviously it's using home electricity. But is it okay if I bring one of my colleagues in? Maura, do you want?
If you want to bring anyone in, no one's going to tell you you can't.
I was asking you the permission of the convener, if that's
please don't. Please bring her in. I'll say it for a shorter time.
I think a few other points that are important to bear in mind is that a large part of the cost of charging is associated with the cost of energy and has therefore, at least in part, determined by decisions that the UK government have made around electricity prices. So we understand from the charging industry that standing charges have risen dramatically, almost 500%, I think, since 2021, and that's decisions made by Ofgem, and that's particular to EV charging. We also understand that the UK government has launched a review into the cost of charging, so we're fully engaged with the UK government on that review, which I believe will publish towards the end of 2026 and will have a bearing on the cost of EV charging. And so those are important points to bear in mind.
But there's still a huge difference between charging at home and charging in a public charging point,
Indeed.
regardless of the cost of the electricity.
Indeed, and the charging industry has been very clear that the additional VAT that's placed on public EV charging that you don't pay if you're a domestic customer is a barrier to the uptake, and we have called on the UK government to review that position.
But even when we take that out, there's still a huge gap between charging at home and charging in a public place. And, you know, it's back to the point, if you own your own driveway, it's probably going to be cheaper to drive an EV. If you don't, it's probably going to be more expensive.
I think you're stating the obvious, which everybody understands and agrees, and I think that's an important challenge. We don't have responsibility for energy prices. That's why I was saying in part of delivering of this, UK policy is really important here, and that is why we all need to work together in terms of delivering this decarbonisation. But trying to tackle the pricing is really important. One of the things, the limited areas that we can do something about, we've, as part of the budget, introduced a 10-year tax relief for public charging. That again reduces the costs on the infrastructure. That's one thing we could do, and we have done. The VAT issue would make a big difference if that could be delivered, but we are not in a position to deliver that. That's clearly the responsibility of UK governments, and they haven't done it previously, and they're currently not doing it. But I do think if you're going to have the shift that we need to have, being realistic about energy prices and having powers over electricity costs and prices, particularly in this area, is something that has to be tackled if we're to really be serious, and that's across the UK. So you make a very obvious and very important point, and I would agree with that.
I'll move on to the next question. So some witnesses have told the committee that that the draft CCP places too much emphasis on moving to EVs, and what we should be doing instead is actually reducing the amount of miles done by motor vehicles of all types. So how do you respond to that?
So I can understand that criticism. Previously, that would have been more of a focus, but as a result of, and I think we're right to take the advice of the UK Climate Change Committee, that they have themselves identified that the biggest and quickest way to have the shift that's required is actually to focus on replacing petrol diesel cars with electric vehicles. Now that's the context, that's the policy context which we've understood, which we've accepted, which we have taken forward, and that is why our target is on 16% car, emissions from cars in particular. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to do work in other areas, including supporting people to access public transport, to make that shift to use their car less. In some areas, particularly in rural Scotland, that's just not going to be possible because of the geography that we have. The availability of public transport is more of a challenge in rural areas than it is in urban areas, as you absolutely know. But in terms of the funding that we're putting forward, we've got a big programme of support for public transport use. The Under-22s scheme, which is extremely successful, is helping support a new generation from a behaviour change point of view, but habit forming, to use buses, and also the concessionary scheme itself extends to over 60s in Scotland. In terms of other areas, we're continuing the electrification of rail and encouraging people to use rail. It's one of the reasons we've also taken the decision to take peak fares on our railways off for good, and that also helps encourage people to use public transport. On car use itself, a part of that is the extensive support which is continuing and is in the budget for active travel. Will help people make other choices about how they might travel, or to mix their travel with active travel as well as public transport, and minimise car use where they can. So we're still working in the car use reduction space. Our measurement is on emissions, and we're following in terms of the overall emissions reduction. Our target is for a 4% reduction by 2030, and the UK Climate Change Committee reflect that themselves, but also then extend that to 6% over the longer period.
4% Cabinet Secretary. Is that the amount of miles done, or is that just the carbon? I think that's quite important.
So our target is 16% emission reduction, right? So that's what we've and I'd always said this right throughout this year, that's exactly, you know, we were going to revise where we're putting, because blunt car use reduction on average doesn't help in a country like Scotland, where you've got cities, yes, but extensive rural areas. Of that, 4% is going to be about car use reduction. So it's not all going to be about straight switch to EVs. There's going to have to be some movement in terms of car use reduction, which is much less, of course, as you will know, from what had previously been in the previous climate change plan. But I don't know if, is there anything else to add to that? No. Or you want to? I would just point out it's miles.
Yeah,
is that what you're saying? It's miles.
Yeah,
4% mileage reduction.
4% mileage reduction.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Gavina.
We leave EVs, which I think Sarah wants to come on. Of course, Douglas, my only point is that the analogies you gave of who it was cheaper for, of course, it's cheaper for those people in the Parliament because we get free electric charging, which I've often questioned. Sarah.
Thank you, Convener. I was going to follow up on the incentivisation issue to ask about what the Scottish Government's doing in terms of new homes and existing homes to enable people to install the conversion tech, because all new homes have to have some form of renewables when they're built, and that's a huge opportunity to do a conversion to EVs, which is a cheaper way to charge it at home using power that you've stored up. So I wanted to ask both about new homes, but also about existing homes. What's the incentive, particularly if homes have installed solar or they've got access to low grid electricity?
So I think you make a very good point about the sort of interconnectivity of energy sources within homes and how that can be used. I'm not sure, therefore, in terms of the additional incentivisation in terms of the equipment. That tends, if you've bought an EV car, you'll know that that's quite often that's part of the deal that you get in some cases. So again, it's about not displacing other aspects. We have in the past had funding to help in workplace and some home charging. So that has existed in the past. That might be an incentive we could have going forward for those with driveways, etc. So in the pot of what could be in the incentive area, I would put that in that category. But the integration with the housing policy is one that I don't know whether, Phil, you look at things over the piece, whether there's anything in relation to that, but that makes sense, is that obviously that's part of the whole new build kind of area. I'm not a housing minister, so I'm not going to go into that.
I'm raising it because it's been raised with me by people who have bought a new house and then they discover that even though they've got solar panels, they actually have to invest a fair amount to actually get the converter in place to actually be able to charge the car. So isn't it something we should just be making standard, where you've got homes with car drives and having a more joined up approach?
Yeah, I think that makes absolute sense in terms of that will obviously in the planning regulations for new build, etc. I don't want to commit other cabinet secretaries are in terms of policy, but I think the point about the more we can do to encourage it from as to be natural and from start. But in terms of what would be required, there's obviously the kind of existing and converting, and then obviously new build. And I'm not as familiar with the new build planning regulations. That it's maybe something we can come back to you on, because I think it's a good point, well made. So more now.
I would suggest that we can follow up in writing, but it is worth remembering that in 2023 we introduced new building standards on the installation of charge points in new buildings and developments. And I think in addition, as Cabinet Secretary points out, we have supported financially a substantial volume of grants to households to install domestic charge points, and that is under consideration as part of the development of the new consumer incentive schemes.
It's maybe just to make the more general point, which is self-evident, but it's probably worth stating out loud. It's a draft climate change plan. We expect that the consultation, the point of the consultation, the point of these evidence sessions is to hear new ideas, to hear things that we may have considered, that may have been, we may have thought of over time, or things that we thought, actually, that is an excellent point. That is linking together different areas, and we need to think about it. So we would hope, in fact, we welcome all these ideas coming forward so that we can consider them for the final plan.
Okay, so I will come back But we'll check the 2023 new build regulations and see if that is compatible with what you're saying.
Thanks. Well, look forward to that, both for new build and thoughts about conversions for existing homes. That would be very useful. My next...
If you're going to move off from... Yes, I know you've got the next question,
right, okay.
but just before we move off EVs, Mark has indicated he might like a quick question before we come back to you, sir.
My understanding is that the European Union have got a regulation in relation to a minimum number of EV charging points in workplaces, but it was something which the Scottish Government a number of years ago decided to not align itself with the EU on that. We haven't adopted that minimum. So I'm just interested in whether that you know, Phil, would be an area where the government could think again and perhaps require EV charging at workplaces, and then presumably that could you know, that could reflect a better electricity price as well, or even free charging maybe at workplaces. Absolutely not.
So there's a bit obviously about what the private sector would have said. The different partners can drive this. It's not for government to make, or they could make, or as part of new planning regulations, whatever. That's obviously open to folk to consider. But actually, I think you'd find in reality most workplaces that have got extensive car use are already providing EV charging locations. So I suppose the issue is, how do you encourage that further, or do you mandate it? And I think your suggestion is that you think it should be mandated as part of. Yeah. And again, just as the 2023 housing regs is not something that I'm overtly familiar with, we can check whether the existing planning approvals, some of that might be from local authorities as well. So, for example, this big announcement, I think Sky have just announced a big development in Livingston. And you know, would that, for example, in that new build, would the planning requirements of the local authority require them as part of the condition of whatever? So I think there's different levers that can be pulled at different levels. I'm not sure whether it would need anything at national level, but it might need it at local authority level. But it would make sense, and I think actually, you know, it makes sense for employers themselves and workplaces to provide that. I don't know what rate, or to work with partners to deliver that. And I think the other thing is about co-location. You're increasingly finding, and we're trying to use our funding to help provide co-location so that other types of vehicles can use. So First Bus, for example, their site in Glasgow, they've actually got opened up to the public to be able to use their charging infrastructure. So we're seeing more use by different areas. So it's a very important area. I think we'll take that away and have a look at it. There may be some things happening already, which we'll also have to check out what's happening for employers and their workplaces.
I know Michael wants to come in very quickly. Can I just say that time marches on. The clock never stops for the committee, sadly. So, Michael, quickly, and then I'm coming back to you, Mark, for your questions.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Good morning. Just following up on the £30 million, I think you said, of investment into EV charging infrastructure over the course of the next year, which has been distributed to local authorities. Is that right? It was allocated previously. It's now with local authorities. They set up consortium, mostly different local authorities coming together, Highlands and Islands, and that consortium was one of the first ones. And I said the Edinburgh and South East was one of the later ones. And then they're working with the private sector to identify where they want to have their charging to allow that geographical range, as you're talking about. It's helpful. Do we know from that investment how much of that that capital expenditure is going into the local supply chain? I don't know if Maura wants to come in on this, but clearly that's for the consortium to establish how they're going to deliver, because they're the delivery arm in that. In terms of the their supply chain, I wouldn't have the details of that for each and every consortium, but I don't know if there's anything we can provide on that, Maura.
Certainly, we could provide some further information. I should say that while the £30,000 has been 30 million, apologies, has been indicated to all local authorities, we're still in the course of paying out grants to local authorities as each of those consortia moves into delivery phases. And as part of those arrangements with local authorities, we are looking to monitor clearly the deliverables of those contracts, including installation of new charge points, but equally wider co-benefits. That is measured and monitored as part of those arrangements, and we can write to the committee with further detail.
I mean, can I also point out that's a requirement of all grants that come out from government, so that we can actually identify what is in the local supply chain. So it's more of a general procurement condition of grant aspect that would measure that.
So can I just be clear? So in the grant conditions, do we set any specification for local content for the consortia to use when using that money to comply with? Do we, you know, this could be £30 million that just flows right out of the Scottish market into other contractors. Do we make any specification about local content of a percentage of how much that grant is allocated?
No, there is not a specific target set for local content as part of these contracts, but as I say, the
Can I ask why we wouldn't do that?
I would probably suggest that we write to the committee with further specifics. What is true is that each of those arrangements with the local authority seeks to maximise economic and social benefits, and we're in discussion with each of the local consortia partners about the best way to do that.
But you don't specify that?
But it would be part of the general requirements.
We
for
set
public.
no limits on it, but we set no expectation levels on it at all.
Is that a wider question about local content and funding that goes to local authorities? Because
Well, the bottom line is...
in which
you-
case
well,
it may
you-
be a
you-
matter
well,
for...
Well, hold on. You're spending £30 million, allocating it to local authorities. What I'm asking is, how do you maximise the amount of that capital investment get into the local economy? Because we know that infrastructure investment is a multiplier for economic benefit. So what I'm asking you is, do you specify in the grant programme how much local content should be used in order to maximise that economic benefit? The danger is the money just flows right out the country, despite the fact that we're investing £30 million in EV infrastructure.
So there will be local content, I know, because in all the different places that I'm going to, where public investment has been, it's usually, and you hear it's going to be Scottish companies that are delivering this. So we can come back to the committee to give you an idea from that. There are general rules around the issue of public grant, which in relation to, it's not a direct procurement. We're not doing the procuring. The issue is local authorities are doing the procuring. So the issue in terms of the responsibilities for the procurement aspect of it, they will be governed by local authorities' procurement rules. And many local authorities, as you know, will have specifications within their procurement. So remember, there's a difference between when we are procuring actual work and when we're giving grants to local authorities to do the procurement themselves. But within that, we'll be able to provide you the assurance that there is, local content as part of that. So there's different ways of doing that. And I think I'd indicated before to the committee, and we sent you the links that Transport Scotland publish in terms of their own work and the procurement, and in terms of that local impact as well. And that is a report that's been published. And after, I think, my last evidence session, we sent it to the committee as well. But we'll follow that up, and it's a point well made.
Thank you. Sarah, I was going to avoid you, but wrongly, so back to you now.
Convener.
I apologise.
No, thanks, Convener. I wanted to ask about the car use reduction target, because I understand it's not now going to be set until the final version of the plan's published. So I just wanted to know if the Scottish Government has settled on a target, and if you can explain the thinking behind the level you've now set, or are thinking of setting.
So I think Morna helped to explain that previously as well in terms of what we'd set. So it's a 16% emissions reduction, but we're also seeing a 4% in terms of car mile reduction. I think there are challenges around that, whether that's enough and whether we should try and encourage that to be more. I know some of the evidence sessions you've taken, people would think that is. There are other reasons, not just emission reduction, as to why you want to look at whether it's from a road safety point of view, whether it's from health and well-being. There are still particulates that obviously people are concerned about. So I think that's one where, in terms of where we are now and where we might move on, that obviously is an area that I know is up for public discussion, and I suspect political points from different political parties.
I wanted to follow up the question, because I'd heard it being briefly discussed earlier, and ask what alternatives are going to be put in place to enable that 4% reduction. So thinking about regional planning with local authorities, obvious issues are increasing rail capacity. I know it's a major issue in my region in terms of accessibility on trains being full up for commuters, Borders Railway, Fife, issue within Edinburgh, new potential projects like the South Suburban Railway, which uses existing infrastructure. How are you actually going to work with local authorities to ensure you've got the capacity in place? And of course, the other side is buses. We've lost a large number of bus services. How do you work with bus companies and local authorities in more rural areas? You've mentioned that earlier, where it's there's not a choice for lots of people. But if you want to enable people to not use cars or have a better alternative, where's the regional planning to actually deliver it in practice?
So clearly our regional transport partnerships are key in this, and I've had over my time in post a number of meetings with them looking at joint strategic approaches, and many of them have taken on very strong initiatives themselves. They're very keen on, for example, the Bus Infrastructure Fund, which has been not only restored, but it's £60 million, is up from £20 million to £60 million. So that will help in terms of delivering the Bus Infrastructure Fund that both bus companies and indeed the regional planning authorities, the regional transport authorities are wanting to see. What does that do? That incentivises if you're sitting in a queue on the M8 and your bus flies by, or you're sitting elsewhere and you're seeing that it's much easier and quicker to get in by bus. That obviously is an incentive as well. More locally, I think that's more of a challenge. You'll be familiar with the range of powers that are available under the Transport Scotland 2019 Act, and in terms of the regulations, you've been considering them as a committee. The plugged-in communities is also really important for rural areas. Again, that's funded and we're in terms of the budget, so therefore that's another area in terms of our sustainable travel that we're taking forward. In terms of rail capacity, obviously there's new fleet coming in terms of how that will help in terms of frequency and indeed the pressures on Fife and Borders. We've already started the electrification on the Fife line, and the closure of Haymarket, Dalmeny, disruptive but very necessary, and I inspected that and saw that myself just the other week. And obviously for the Borders, that will help in terms of improving the Borders line in terms of the electrification of that will help improve the service more generally. What that does in terms of rail procurement, it also allows some cascade of some fleet that can help in other areas, which is one of the things that we're looking, that's part of the kind of ongoing area. In terms of the planning, clearly the ball is in the court of the local regional transport partnerships, and obviously in terms of the southeast of Scotland, they've got quite an extensive proposals of what they might want to see in terms of that aspects, and that's obviously led by them, but referenced in the infrastructure investment pipeline that was set out.
Comment there was that what they might like to see. It's how you actually focus in and target areas where you've already got effectively lack of supply in terms of numbers of carriages, capacity on trains. I've heard of people in Borders and Fife, you just can't get on the train, it's full by the time it arrives. So where does that fit in terms of priority if you're actually going to give people the alternatives to actually using their car to commute on those key areas?
So the consequence of ensuring that we have cheaper rail prices, particularly for commuters, by taking off peak rail fares, that on average is a 17% saving. In the Glasgow-Edinburgh corridor, that's 48%.
The issue I was making was not about the cost to the consumer or the traveller about the capacity of the service.
No, I
to
understand.
enable them?
If you reduce, but I'm saying is if you reduce the cost, you increase the number of people that are wanting to use it, which is a good thing. And that's quite clearly, and I see that regularly on the Glasgow-Edinburgh line. And you know, but there are limits to the number of carriages that any particular train or station, more tends to be the stations, can carry as well. But obviously in terms of the extensive investment that we have in our rail area for electrification and new fleet, that is also about making improvements. But frequency is, when we talk about capacity, so there's length of and numbers of carriages, they'll be different in terms of the number of seats that are in different carriages. And this is where I'll probably be careful I don't get this wrong because it's getting to a level of detail. But in terms of the replacement fleet that's likely, that we're also procuring for the Fife and Borders, but there will be increased seats in the carriages. It's the issue of the number of carriages that will be available for that. But the frequency and improvements that electrification can bring, we're already seeing that in the East Kilbride line that has just been electrified, helps in that area as well. But clearly, I think there's a general challenge for the southeast of Scotland because of the population increases and the major housing developments that are being approved right across Mid Lothian, East Lothian, and in my own constituency, an area of West Lothian as well.
And finally, will this be monitored? Because as you reduce your car mileage target, you need to make sure you're monitoring that's actually aligning with public transport availability, both buses and trains.
Yes, and that's obviously measured and monitored and reported on in different areas. There has been fluctuation because clearly the amount of people that are home working will affect particular journeys at particular times, although we are seeing recovery across public transport from pre-pandemic levels. But obviously the pattern has changed and the timing has changed. We're seeing more leisure travel, for example, in the evening, which is very welcome. And also at the weekends, perhaps if people are working from home, they'll want to get out the house and go somewhere else. And so we're seeing a change, and I think the whole system has to adapt to usage and patronage, but also capacity. But I wouldn't underestimate the challenges in the Edinburgh and Lothians region, simply because of the growth in the number of people as well.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. We're now going to move to Mark and just say that remind people the clock is marching on. Mark.
It does. I mean, what Sarah Boyack is talking about is essentially one side of the equation, isn't it? I mean, it's about improving services, building capacity, putting in better quality infrastructure. But we have had a lot of evidence as a committee that that's not enough if you want to get modal shift. So there needs to be some form of localised travel demand management alongside all those improvements in active travel, public transport infrastructure and capacity. So does the government support that approach of putting in local travel demand management, likes of congestion charging, workplace parking? Do you see that as essential if we're to meet the climate targets or not?
So it will be different in different parts of the country, and I think there has to be a responsiveness to local assessment of what that is. So in some areas, particularly in the city of Glasgow and certainly in the city of Edinburgh, there is an appetite to do that. And in terms of local congestion charging, that will be up to the local authorities. The legislation that was put in place, I can't remember if it's 2001, 2003 legislation, I'm looking at Sarah Boyack, which one, 2001? And that provided for what would be congestion charging in terms of, so the law already exists, it's not been used to date. What we are doing is, at the request of those local authorities that are interested, is doing an assessment as to whether the regulations that we have as a country, as a country in law, are fit for purpose. Should they want to use it at some point in the future, they'll have to take people with them in doing that. It is a tool that's available. However, it's part of a mix, and if you've got a situation where you've got swifter public transport from buses because they've got more priorities within cities, I think that's one of the single biggest things I know Glasgow's very, very keen on. So therefore the expansion of funding of £60 million for the bus infrastructure fund is really important there. So there are different tools available. Yes, we can do the emissions reduction by switches to EV, and that's a big, big focus, but it doesn't mean that you don't then and support regional transport partnerships in the solutions that they want to come up to in terms of how they manage the transport within their own area. And obviously there's some interest in doing that. The tools are available. We're just making sure if the tools are fit for purpose, should those local authorities want to use it in the future.
If there's no uptake of local travel demand management, no congestion charging, no other measures, would you be able to meet the targets that are within the plan?
What, the 4% car mileage reduction? I don't know that. We need to look at the kind of projections for those individual cities going forward. But I think there are other reasons to do it as well. I mean, it's you know, in terms of the quality of life, the particulates, and trying to reduce reduce car usage in a city we know internationally actually enhances economic growth and footfall in hospitality, in leisure, etc. So there are costs and benefits for all of these policies, but don't underestimate the benefits of doing it for other reasons than just car.
I certainly don't underestimate those benefits, but I acknowledge it can be difficult to sell. And I suppose the other evidence we've had of the committee is, if you look at Environmental Standards Scotland, their concern about, the government perhaps not having ownership of individual programmes, leadership being a little weak in some areas, no contingency plans. So it feels like this is in a space where we're sort of reliant on local authorities to have a conversation. If it doesn't happen, then, well, something else will come up to deal with it. I know this is hard. I acknowledge it's hard. But I'm just struggling to see where the leadership is here. And if this doesn't happen, are we just going to be reliant on, peak rail fares going and everything else to try and get that membership?
The biggest reliance is on people switching to EV cars, and that means, still car use. It's not, it's not saying that people can't use cars. That what we're saying is, as the previous UK government and the current UK government is saying, is we need to do that switch if we're trying to tackle climate change and reduce car emissions by reducing emissions by switching to EVs. However, it's not the only tool, and it's obviously quite controversial. Anybody sitting in the debate that we had on congestion charging, just about every party, including the Labour Party, were against it, as well. So at that point, so there is a kind of, how do you take people with you and what can be challenging things to do? And if there's a requirement, and perhaps a national body like ESS would want to see national enforcement and national leadership and everything centralised, I think if you did everything on a centralised basis, you wouldn't take people with you. And I think on a lot of this, you're going to have to take people with you. And the best way of doing that is in partnership. So I've had quite good and challenging discussions with local authorities through COSLA and also with Regional Transport Partnership. I don't underestimate their desire, and that's why don't think that local authorities don't want to have leadership in here. Many do. They want support in what they're doing, and that's why, particularly if you look at some of the active travel infrastructure, once it's built, extremely popular. Local authorities very pleased and proud of what they're doing in terms of delivery there. The bus infrastructure fund, they've been crying out for some time. Obviously, financial pressures meant that there was a real challenge with the cut in our capital budget generally, so therefore that was a challenge. We're now back on track with that, which is very good. But I generally, in all my time in government, I would say if you can do it in partnership with people, you're more likely to have an effective result. So rather than doing things to local authorities, I'd rather do them with local authorities.
Okay, and obviously that then raises the issue of multi-year budgets and investment in infrastructure, active travel, which demand management measures can supply one source of revenue for. But what's your thinking on providing certainty over particularly active travel capital investment over time? Because there has been calls for moving away from one-year budget. Let's see what comes out in the budget from one year to the next, to move towards longer-term programmes of investment, so we can really get the supply chain moving, and there's confidence then from contractors that they can move fully into the infrastructure side of things.
So I think, multi-year budgets are right across lots of different areas. You'll know, because you'll sit in other committees, have other interests, but multi-year budgets provides, I think, better value for public procurement because there's better planning, and it's also the pipeline of experience of people that are doing it, etc. And that's been a real challenge in recent years because 1 year budgets from the UK government to the Scottish Government means there's been 1 year budgets that we've had to establish, and you end up having a lot of stop-start, especially if you have an emergency budget from the UK government. At one point you have to readjust everything. We've had to have consequences. So I absolutely understand the frustrations from people that have been trying to manage this and also keep good and talented people working for them in delivering that pipeline. The budget investment for 2026 to 2027 is a proposed £226 million in sustainable and active travel, and that delivers our strategic commitments generally, which have been ongoing for some time, but also those set out in the draft climate change plan. I'm hopeful we'll be able to continue that and provide that certainty, but I think it's better use of public funding. It gives more confidence and it will deliver better results. And obviously, in terms of the works that are going on, you can see it, and they are extremely popular in lots of different areas, and connecting communities as well. I think active travel can help give people alternative choices as to what wheel and cycle, and particularly even if they're then using another form of transport at the end of that. But it's also connecting communities, and what we're finding is, and certainly I've seen it firsthand, is it's connecting a lot of towns, villages with each other, which I think is making a big impact in how people use their own space and use their own towns and can access things in their own towns in an easier and better way, and particularly for children. And you can see that most evidently.
Okay. Well, Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. The convener said earlier we would touch again upon HGVs, so let's do that now. Some argue that the uptake of zero-emission HGVs is technically and feasibly impossible, particularly when it comes to electric power. Can I ask, in terms of HGVs, how can we push to look at hydrogen as a fuel? And is there the possibility of looking at low carbon fuels as an alternative? And does the CCP reflect this?
So there's a number of things within that. I wouldn't be dismissive of the use of electrification on HGVs. There's a very active interest in market, and in terms of the location of for example, the charging. I think I've probably relayed to this committee before. We have worked with Heriot Watt about doing the mapping of where you'd have charging. Yes, for electrification, but potentially for hydrogen as well in terms of that area. And that's something that the rest of the UK are interested in, that work. And so that they can, and again, that's it's quite a market freight and haulage is quite a market sensitive area, but there's been a lot of data sharing, which I think is good for the sector. It needs to come together in order to plot and plan where they'd want to have charging. Hydrogen obviously is potentially more suitable for heavier, whether it's going to be a potential in the future for shipping and indeed on rail, where there has been initial pilots, but their focus on freight and HGVs is limited, although JG Russell in Lanarkshire have got UK funding from some UK environmental innovation funding, so they're trialling a limited number of hydrogen vehicles. They're obviously kind of close to terminus as well, and I think that's part of it, is in trialling that out. But I wouldn't underestimate the fact that you can do electric vehicles. I visited, it was forestry and indeed timber haulier, where the Scottish Government from Transport Scotland and also the Environment Department are funding a pilot for timber haulage vehicles that are electric. Now, again, short distances, but part of it is testing it, looking at the finances of it. So the key to this will be the financial models that can be used.
So I'm not saying that there are no electric vehicles out there. I know that there are, but industry itself says that they don't see it as a viable option at this moment in time, whereas others say that they're willing to explore other areas. In terms of hydrogen, at this moment we have 3, possibly 4 hydrogen refuelling stations in Scotland, 2 of which are in Aberdeen. Is that an impediment to moving forward in hydrogen? Is the fact that the UK government is stalling still on changing regulation and hydrogen storage and transportation a problem, and holding the possibility of hydrogen back?
So you're obviously interested in hydrogen specifically. Obviously, we've supported hydrogen in the past, particularly in Aberdeen. This committee visited the hydrogen bus fuelling station in Aberdeen as part of its inquiry, one of its very first inquiries into working with local authorities in delivering net zero. And that was one of the inquiries I was very keen that the committee did when I was a member of it. I think you touched on a very important point. I think the UK government will need to change its policy on hydrogen generally. I think it doesn't see the potential for hydrogen in the way it can and should do. And I think in terms of that space, that's more in the more wider energy aspect, because obviously in terms of Scotland's capability in renewables, generation of green hydrogen, generation of hydrogen for export. Hydrogen, I think, has a big part to play in Scotland's future, but I think we're at some distance in terms of applicability in relation to transport. And one of the areas you've identified as really important is the approach in terms of hydrogen from the UK government in terms of their policy on that, and that includes technical safety. And that's one of the big issues in rail. Some of us will have visited the prototype hydrogen train as part of the COP Glasgow exhibition, and obviously the issue there is transportation safety will obviously be paramount in that area. Scotland has taken a lead, though, in the work we've done with Heriot-Watt to map where they would need to be in terms of those hydrogen charging as well as electric charging. And I think that's a really important area. Your point about viability in relation to electric vehicles for hauliers is well made, which is exactly why we're working with the private sector, looking at finances. I spoke at an event where we brought together both financiers and the haulage industry to identify, and we've actually funding as of this year, as well as into next year, work on HGVs and how do you help create that market in a sustainable, viable way, which we've done previously for buses, and we're wanting to continue that for HGVs. Morna, have you got anything else?
Yes, thanks. I thought it might be helpful also just to reflect again on some of the market developments here and the increasing viability of electric HGVs. So we've seen evidence that I think the statistics show that last year's sales of battery electric trucks in China were 22%. That's obviously China, but closer to home in Europe. There were over 16,000 new zero-emission HGVs registered last year.
But you're not convincing people here yet of that, and I think that is the key point. Doesn't matter what's happening in China in terms of electricity. We also know that China is putting a huge amount of money into hydrogen as well. It's how do you change the minds of people here in order to meet the climate change ambitions.
If the people you're talking about are the haulage companies, then we are talking directly with the haulage companies and the hauliers. And in terms of the Road Haulage Association, was at the session that we had here in Edinburgh just a few months ago, along with different companies, major haulier companies that are interested in this area. It's how to get the finances to stack up, which is actually one of the interesting lessons we're getting from the pilot timber company that's operating in Inverness, is what is the sweet spot that actually makes it make sense, right? Because you're right, until it makes sense financially, people aren't going to do it, right? So that's why we're engaging. It's why we're actually putting resources, time and effort into this area, working with the sector to help convince them that it's possible. But it's not just a case of convincing. They are interested. I know this will be a requirement, because remember, the UK government itself will be looking at mandates in relation to HGV EV, and they're starting that progress as well. So that'll start to kind of, I suppose it's a pincer movement. It's demand, but also in the other areas. And you also talked about biofuels, which is important. Obviously, aviation is where we want the key market for that. And obviously where there's also challenges in how in a country like Scotland where the main focus of that should be, but also, for example, rail, some of the lines that aren't going to be electrified anytime soon, there's potential there as well.
Moving on a little, the draft CCP itself predicts that there'll be zero reduction in emissions from aviation and shipping up until 2040, which is a fair while away. We've discussed the possibility there of hydrogen for shipping, Cabinet Secretary, and I'm sure the government will continue to push that. And obviously, there's already looks at what can be done in terms of aviation. But one of the early ways, in my opinion, of reducing shipping emissions would be to look at, for example, what is happening at the Port of Aberdeen, where onshore charging itself, shore-to-ship charging, is reducing emissions dramatically. And of course, the port itself has an ambition to become a net zero port in the near future. Are the government looking at helping enhance shore-to-ship charging? And is there any help from the UK government in helping funding that, which would reduce emissions greatly, particularly beneficial to those ports which are in the middle of cities or towns, like the Port of Aberdeen is?
So I can't speak for the UK government on what support they're providing, but I'll try and find out and let you know about that. On the Port of Aberdeen, of course, it's an important development. We've helped fund it. The Scottish Government has helped fund that because it is an important development in terms of onshore charging. I'm very keen that the ports and harbours are not put to the back of the queue in terms of onshore charging in any shape or form. And so we are actively speaking with the from a distribution point of view with energy companies, but also I have encouraged, and it's one of the first things I've said to a variety of different UK transport ministers that I've met, is when you're looking at energy and energy transmission, the one biggest thing that will make a difference will be about that distribution of energy and where it is and when it is. And they need to be in the room as part of that in those discussions in terms of their energy colleagues. Also, Kate Forbes chairs an offshore renewables ports and harbours group that have come together themselves, and they're working very actively to the proposition, if we're generating all this energy in Scotland in terms of renewable energy, we have to benefit from that. Ports and harbours are absolutely critical. So the rollout of that is absolutely key and really important. In terms of some of the issues in terms of the measurements on aviation shipping, because they've been, and Phil and others will correct me if I'm wrong, they've been baselined already, and a lot of that is obviously planning for technological changes in the future. But the work, for example, with Zero Avia at Glasgow, again supported and funded in part by the Scottish Government, a grant there, helping some of the activity at Glasgow Airport. And discussing Glasgow Airport, it's the issue around if you can get, for example, smaller planes that we have for our islands using different alternatives, then hydrogen storage, again, it's a safety issue, and they've been working with academics as to what the how you would manage hydrogen safely on site, particularly for airports. So there's obviously potential there. Some of it's about technological development, but obviously in terms of ports and harbours, I could not echo your points more clearly, and I do on a regular basis to ensure that we get the benefits of the energy we're producing, but also to make sure we can electrify it. And finally, your interest in hydrogen, and I was at the launch of in Leith of it's a pilot, it's an innovation, but it's taken green hydrogen from local sources to perform charging from hydrogen for electric. It's for tugs. It's nothing. It wasn't. I'm not over exaggerating kind of the size of it, but it's proof of concept. And again, that's working. The UK government provided some innovation UK funding for that as well. So part of what we have to do is make sure we're complementary in what we're funding in the innovation space in particular.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, just before we move back to HGVs, because we hadn't quite finished that, I think Mark had a question on shipping. Mark, do you want to come in? Or has it been answered?
It was actually in relation to aviation. But
Okay, well then I'm going to go back to HGVs first, and then we can talk about aviation, just to keep the Cabinet Secretary on her toes. Deputy Convener, you had a question.
Thanks. Just going back to the issue of HGVs, you'll be aware of the evidence we received from Logistics UK, who thought the target which had been set around the electrification of HGVs, I'm not quoting them directly, but I think the bottom line was they thought it was completely unrealistic. It wouldn't be delivered. And I understand that this trying to get private investors to look at supporting them. If I recall correctly, I think over 60% of our HGV providers or hauliers in Scotland are actually small businesses. And an electric HGV is about double, if not 3 times the price of a diesel. It's just not financially viable for them at all, given the downtime for charging, etc. They raised the issue of looking at using low-carbon fuels as a transition to the market became more mature and more financially viable for them as an industry. Why don't we do that?
So that's obviously meantime technology in terms of biofuels. The market can do that, and the market can do that. You're right identifying it's 80% of road haulage firms in Scotland have 5 trucks or less. So the financial models that we're working on have to work for them. Now, previously what we can do is, and we've done it before, is have a consortium for any public money where larger companies have to buddy with smaller companies in order to help get resources in terms of looking at what can happen on the electric vehicle technology. Logistics UK are obviously dealing with tight margins now in terms of their operators. It's a highly competitive business, but trying to help support that is really important. The UK government has brought in their plug-in truck grant, so again they're providing finances there. We're co-design. It's not as if we are actively talking already with investors, fleet owners and charge point operators and how we can make sure that private investment works. The issue is, should public funding be focused on delivering carbon emission reduction for net zero, or should it be used, potentially be seen to be diverted into biofuels as a meantime? Now, the challenge on energy management, I think, for biofuels is actually in Scotland, in terms of the different needs, aviation is going to be the biggest requirement, and also the source fuel for biofuels, again, I'm straying into territory that's not my area of expertise, is a danger of causing extra pressure in other areas, whether it's in agriculture or elsewhere. So there's got to be careful management of the source product for biofuels and how it might be used and where it might be used, and actually where, and again that's open to the committee to have a view on, as to do we focus on what we really are trying to do, which is carbon emission reduction, which means net zero, as opposed to the meantime fuels. But I think, as I said, in some potentially probably more in rail or other areas, it might be for heavier goods, it might be there.
Well, my understanding is that these low carbon fuels reduce carbon emissions by 70 to 80%. So it's trying to be realistic for the industry. But if you look at what's in Project Willow, there is a drive to try to help to secure in the Grangemouth area opportunities for things like biofuels. On the issue of SAF, I suspect we won't produce much SAF this side of 2035, and to be realistic, going from the evidence that we've heard as a committee. But it's trying to, but the climate change plan is silent on this. While we've got an industry telling us actually you need to do this, and it's trying to, and I think from the committee's point of view, it's trying to understand why we're silent on something that the industry is saying you're going to have to do this, and also where we've got something like Project Willow that's supporting the idea of investment in these areas as well. It just feels to me as though there's a bit of a mismatch, and it's reflected in this overemphasis on we need to electrify HGVs, where we've got an industry that's basically saying it's not going to happen.
So there's no reason why you can't have, say, meantime fuels, right? I can understand that. The issue is, where should public funding go for that, or should that be, market itself? And I think that's the issue. I think this committee is well placed because you are net zero energy and transport. So you're seeing across the piece, and obviously you speak to all the cabinet secretaries, and I think it's important for government to be aligned in all these parallel. And obviously Project Willow is still live and active, and I think that's where the kind of strategic planning of the energy, the transport, and also the net zero there has to be alignment across that. I think it's fair to say and question, well, where are biofuels within that? But I do think that is probably a genuine public discussion. Is if you've got public funding, where should it go? Should it go on net zero in achieving what are statutory carbon budgets, or should it be used to help subsidise the haulage sector for biofuels, which will go some way there, but won't reach as statutory targets? And I think the issue we've got is a projection of, can we do enough fast enough to get to what our stretching target is? So it's an absolute genuine and open question, and your views on that from the committee would be very welcome.
And my final question on this as well is around the bus industry, which you'll know I've got a long-standing interest in with Alexander Dennis based in my constituency. And there is growing concern within the industry that the 2035 target for no diesel buses is, again, unrealistic and could harm the industry, including the manufacturing industry, and that we should be looking at taking a much more tailed-off approach to how we have, rather than a cliff edge approach. Would the Scottish Government be open to looking at that in order to help to support the bus manufacturing industry in Scotland and the UK by going down the route of looking at a tailed-off approach to the ending of new diesel buses, rather than a cliff edge?
So it's obviously been adopted by a United Kingdom government. This Parliament agreed the target as well. And it goes back to that point that if you don't meet it this way, what are you going to do instead? Because we have statutory requirements. If you're tailing off on the bus sector, if you're tailing off on freight by not going for zero emission, you're going for 70% emission or whatever it is, where else are you going to find your carbon? Your carbon reductions? Are you then going to go into far more enforced demand management, or are you going to go to agriculture instead, or have more severe requirements in relation to housing? So these are genuine questions, but part of the planning of this is to what is understandable, fair and just, and how can you make sure that you can deliver for what's required. But in terms of the aspect for the bus industry, we have supported it substantially. We continue to do that, but we have to work with industry to get to these targets. So if we don't get to these targets, we end up in a situation where we're not meeting our emissions and we are not tackling climate change. And I think this Parliament is clear that it does want to tackle climate change.
Okay, thanks.
Mark, I think you've got a quick question on aviation.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken about, the role for travel demand management in relation to surface transport, but I don't really see any approach to travel demand management in relation to aviation. Again, is that just in the too politically difficult to do box, or like how do you lead the conversation on that? Because you can't ignore the fact that aviation is a major contributor, and there's nothing in this plan that suggests what the reduction in emissions is going to be. So presumably other sectors will just have to pick up the slack.
So there are aviation emissions. I think it's driven more by on the technology side. I'll look to my colleagues to come in on this. And as I said, it's baselined into the plans as is. The initial measures that have been taken in this budget, but they won't be affected for a few years' time. It was announced as part of our proposals that we would be shifting and taking on the powers from the ADT to ABT, and in terms of private jet use in particular. Can I just say, from my perspective as Cabinet Secretary for Transport, my role has been to ensure that Highlands and Islands airports have been protected, and that exemption is absolutely critical. And we also have to work with an industry which is changing, and and people can have strong views about aviation, but the shifts in emission reductions are there. They may not be there to what some people might want, but they are shifting. But the main focus has been ensuring that we can take use of the powers that we have. We will use them responsibly. We are matching the UK government in the first year. There's a consultation on just now, so obviously you can put into the consultation.
Yeah, should you
as well.
be encouraging people to get the train to London, for example, rather than fly? Is that something that government should do?
Yeah, well, we do in lots of different ways, and increasingly, and my regular trips to London are, I use the train because I can work, it's convenient, and I think it's also, you're making that point, you're using a service that is reducing in terms of emissions. So when I can, I do. It's not always possible, but I do.
Just about your personal choices, Cabinet Secretary.
It's
more about the leadership of government in that area.
But in what way? So these are cross-border. So you're talking about cross-border travel. Again, cross-border travel. There's UK responsibility for timetabling, and there's certain reservations still there. I would say on rail, by the way, if I'm allowed, Convener, I'm very, very keen that the committee has a chance and opportunity to look at the rail reform legislation before dissolution. It's going to be really important that we finish our piece of work here if we can. But that cross-border issues are one of the, this is my segue, cross-border issues are obviously a key aspect of rail reform in terms of where we'll be in the future. But so obviously we'd have to work with the UK government on that aspect. And the issue is, should we be subsidising people on the trains to London? And if we're using public money to subsidise people to use the trains to London, are we then not using money to do all the other things that everybody else wants us to do? So that's choices available. I think how you do that on a cross-border basis might be challenging. But I think your point is well made about how do we encourage more people to use trains more often. And I support you in that. I think that's a really important thing that we do. How we do it, though, I think is probably the devil's in the detail of how you might do that. And is that a choice that you'd want to subsidise rail commuters, for example, or should you subsidise bus and make sure there's more rural bus provision? And actually, some of these choices are what all of us are going to have to face in the future.
Okay. Cabinet Secretary, just before we go to Bob, can you just answer me a question? If you turn to Appendix 3 of the Climate Change Plan, page 28, the total benefits in the budget for transport for the period 26 to 30 is 4,334 million. Could you tell me how that is made up, please?
So I've got a colleague just looking at those just now. Is this for which time frame are you talking about?
26-30.
For the 26-30, right.
I want to know how those figures are got to.
Right. So I'm going to ask Phil to explain the financial aspects of how this is put together in terms of the transport baseline. And you're talking about, if I'm correct, page 28, the 2026-2030 total benefits and total costs. So
yeah, we'll come to net costs in a minute.
Well, that's what I said. So
I'm looking at total benefits.
Total benefits.
Where's that figure made up? Where's that 4 billion from?
Well, I could, not being the analyst here, but I can probably say in general terms how it's got to. Because reducing because reducing road emissions is the biggest action that really needs to take place from a transport perspective from 26 to 30, those savings are largely going to consist, those benefits are largely going to consist of the benefits that come to probably individuals and households with regard to EVs. So it will be, usually I think there's two categories of savings you're talking about there. So there will be savings that will happen on running costs, i.e.
benefits. So the benefits.
Yeah, so the benefits. So the benefits would be the savings. The benefits would be it is cheaper over that period to run an EV than it would be to run an ICE car, an ICE vehicle rather, and the capital cost over time would come down as well. So it would be cheaper to get the vehicle over that period. I'll look at my colleagues to think that's largely the. So you're asking what percentage of that is compared to the other aspects of transport benefits and things what have you. I'd have to come back to. We'd have to come back to the committee.
Do you know,
but
Phil,
that's the basic principle.
I understand that, but I've heard different answers from different people in the sense that apparently there's some benefits to the health service, some benefits to this, that and the other. So what would be really helpful, Philip, if it's possible, or Cabinet Secretary, it would be possible to ask Philip to come back to me and explain to me how those £4 billion are broken down over the period. So it's probably too complicated to go through, but I'd like to know how it's apportioned
we'll come back to
before
it.
we do. Okay, on the net costs of the climate change.
Perhaps just one comment there, just to say what we can come back on. Okay, so that cost is financial savings. When you talk about health benefits are separate. They're real. We're doing work to quantify what those other co-benefits are. So there's a whole category of other indirect benefits. But the number you're quoting there, we'll come back with analysis of that. But that doesn't include the health benefits, just to be clear.
That would be very helpful, so I can understand how the £4,334 million is made up over that period. So that would be good, because I like delving in. Now, the net costs are £3,343 million. What are the total costs?
So that's maths. That's a basic mathematical thing. We presented the net costs because that's kind of what the Climate Change Committee have done. That's what the Scottish Fiscal Commission have done. They've looked at net. And net is basically you take the gross costs as a whole and you deduct the benefits. So if you got the net benefit figure, if you got the net cost figure and you have the benefits figure, you can get to the gross cost figure. So I could do the maths here, but I'd hate
Philip,
to be embarrassed.
I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off. I thank you for the lesson, which I had many years ago when I did my accountancy, basic accountancy training. So I'm quite happy. What I'd like to know is what the total costs are to allow you to come up to the net costs, and who's going to pay those total costs. Is that the taxpayer? Is that the government? Who's paying it? Is it industry? That's all I'm asking for, just to break down so I understand the figures. And I'm very happy you can't give that to me just now, because no one's been able to give it to me. But I'm very happy to see it in a paper afterwards, so I can see how the figures match up.
Well, perhaps I could maybe specify on basically who pays. We're not setting out the distribution of costs for a number of reasons. One is it's difficult to predict, and it would be probably misleading for us to predict who would be paying those costs, particularly over the period of the climate change plan as a whole. Okay. We can't say what the UK government may do next year and the year after, which might affect how much the public sector, the private sector has to do. The contributions private sector may make on, for example, things like EV infrastructure and a lot of the things we've talked about today, we can't predict it. So we could put our finger in the air. Putting our finger in the air is not what we're going to be doing for the climate change plan, so we've not set out the breakdown of costs. As for the total costs, those gross cost figures, as you called them, they are simple mathematics. There's nothing hidden here remotely, so we are very happy to come back on that.
Well, I think like all good exam questions, even if you don't get the right answer, you show your workings, and that's all I'm asking for. And what I would also say to you is that, at the end of the day, the Cabinet Secretary made it entirely clear, rather than tell people what to do, is to encourage them to follow you. And so encouraging them to follow you in this journey, which it is a journey that is being suggested to net zero, they're going to have to know how much they're going to have to put, how deep they're going to have to put their hand into their pockets to pay for it. And that's what I'm trying to get to. Bob, you've got some questions.
I've got one very specific question, just mopping up some stuff around electric vehicles. Sorry, we've covered that already, Cabinet Secretary, but there's a link to the point I think the convener was making. There was a debate earlier on, Cabinet Secretary, about the cost of new electric vehicles. I thought we'd take time to check the market during committee, and there's some evidence to show that electric vehicles are now cheaper in the used market than internal combustion engine vehicles. And one periodical suggesting over a 5-year lifespan, used vehicles could be £5,000 cheaper to run than ICE vehicles. The reason I'm putting that on the record, Cabinet Secretary, is because in terms of costs and benefits, the market is going to dictate much of that, and I've no doubt the periodical I'm looking at is trying to encourage people to switch to EVs, so I don't know how robust those figures are, so I'm not quite sure how robust we get to all those figures, the sum of figures that the exchange you were having there with Cabinet Secretary and Mr Rains. So I've just put that on the record, but it was in relation to electric vehicles, and it was in relation to a just transition. I'm conscious that we've had a conversation about those in remote and rural areas and the challenges and the specific actions that government's taken in relation to that. But I represent a very high urban dense area, many tenements in those areas, and you said to Mr Lumsden it would be self-evident there'd be more challenges in those areas as well. So I accept all of that. What I'd be keen to know, and I'm sorry for taking so long to get there, Cabinet Secretaries, how will some of that be monitored going forward? Because we find out that certain households will have to pay more, have less convenience, and be more price sensitive to all of this. And those tend to be in more lower income areas with higher density populations. How will that be monitored? How will it be captured? And will the government take corrective action going forward? So if in 3 or 4 years' time we see there's an inequity for my constituents, what actions can government take to correct some of that?
I think your initial points set out how, in terms of the cost issues to people and actually the benefits, it's shifting even in recent years, and so therefore predictability over longer pieces is even more challenging. But the move is happening. I think your point about monitoring is really important. The social household survey, I'm very keen that we capture information about EV use, etc. from that. That will also be able to be drilled down to be able to identify other areas where the uptake hasn't been as much. Some areas have lower car use ownership anyway, cities is an obvious point, but we need to make sure that we're monitoring in different parts of the country. Again, working with local authorities, that will be something that they'll want to monitor in terms of their own use and their own transport planning, in terms of different areas and approvals that they'll be giving, because they'll obviously, as a planning authority, they'll be giving approvals to EV charging and all the rest of it in different areas, and with the guidance that we were talking about from Scots, we've got that for cross pavement. I don't want to put work to them, but I suspect in the future that will also include factored properties, tenements, etc., as to how that can best be done. But I think you're right in terms of how we identify other people that are losing out and who's benefiting most. And this has got to be something that affects everybody and it has an impact on everyone. So there's also a suggestion that we do that in the census, for example, as well. That will give us an uptake going forward if you're wanting to do future projections. So in terms of the statistics, there are different means and methods by which government does it and should do it. I think the Scottish Household Survey is quite good because it does drill down into different communities.
That's helpful. My only additional question would be, Cabinet Secretary, I think, is local authorities absolutely key partners. There's 3 local authorities involved in the pilot you mentioned earlier on. Also, Cabinet Secretary, but local authorities sometimes collect data in different ways. So it's just to make sure when local authorities make a case back to government to say, well, look, in terms of a just transition in relation to all of this, we've got a particular impact on our local authority. 32 local authorities, we capture that data in different ways, and it'll be challenging for government to work out where the greatest need perhaps is. So in terms of data and local authorities, will there be a consistency in relation to this?
Do you want to come in?
You may be aware that we've, Scottish Government jointly with COSLA has invested in a research institute through Edinburgh University that is supporting local authorities in building up the capacity to collect that data across the whole range of climate change measures and encouraging them to do that consistency. That's the Scottish Climate Intelligence Service. It's been supported through the Climate Delivery Framework, the Climate Delivery Oversight Group, of which the Cabinet Secretary is a member. So that work is underway to try to encourage and to try to bring local authorities, with the support of COSLA itself, to be providing that kind of, having the ability to provide that data and to bring it together in a way so they can compare and use it.
And that was one of the strongest recommendations from this committee's report into to local government and partners delivering net zero, and that was one of the recommendations to support that service. So again, I think that's a result for this committee and one of its early recommendations from this Parliament.
Thank you.
I'm just looking around at the committee. I think everyone's finished, but so it comes to you, Sue, for a couple of questions.
Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I'm going to carry on the theme regarding electric vehicles, and you spoke a lot about the confidence in the EV charging network. Before I come to reliability, I want to speak about variability in charging, because often it's the local authorities that are determining how much they're paying on the local chargers, whether it be a 7 kilowatt, 22 kilowatt or a 50 kilowatt. And then you've got the private companies that are investing, where you've got 1,000,001 different apps. I certainly have on my phone to figure out how I charge, and you don't know what you're going to be paying until your turn to turn up. And that really does not help with the equity element. And I'm wondering what you're trying to do to encourage those local authority consortiums to perhaps have a much more standard rate, and also the permissions to allow to charge for 90 minutes, then perhaps return that same day. Because at the moment, you cannot in Edinburgh go to a 50-watt kilowatt charger, charge for 90 minutes, and then come back.
So clearly, again, this is working in partnership with local authorities. The issue is local authorities will have decisions that they can and should take themselves for their local area. I do think that that might be an aspect that you might want to encourage COSLA to do, is to work together across local government and trying to get kind of commonality, etc. But in terms of EV charging, the member will know that that's a reserve matter in terms of the regulations of the charging networks. I think it was the previous UK government, the Conservative one, brought in the regulations, I think November 20, whatever it was, 2023 or whatever, and that was to enforce standards of performance for EV chargers. Obviously, a lot of them have been charges are community-based or indeed in rural areas. What you wouldn't want is people not complying with these new regulations and closing. So, one of the things we've done is trying to help support them transition to what they're now required, and the requirement to have contactless payment. Contactless payment is obviously increasingly popular. Obviously, the app use is extensive as well. But those regulations are now becoming more enforceable, and if they're enforced, there'll also be penalties for those charging networks that are not complying in order to raise the standard of delivery. I think the variability you mentioned is there is a market element to this. So clearly, with more private companies been involved in it, they have to obviously have their margins, etc. Understand that. We've done the rates relief I've just talked about. We've just announced the 10-year EV charging point rates relief will be helpful. But I think that commonality of standards, I think, is a good point, particularly with local government. And obviously, if people are familiar with places that are going to, it will be on a similar basis. But they will have also worked out their own finances and their margins and the suppliers. So your point about can we enforce the same prices, for example, goes back to Douglas Lumsden's point about we're not in charge of the electricity pricing. And that's obviously, again, a reserve matter as well.
You charge the West Lothian Council has the same standing charges as Edinburgh Council, yet you pay different rates to charge on their public networks. That's where I was going. And you can sit in a charger in West Lothian for far longer and return than you can in Edinburgh. That variability is what I was trying to get at, I suppose, around that in terms of standards. And I think you did mention COSLA, but I also want to, in terms of moving on that confidence, you turn up at the public charging networks run by these local authorities, a 50-watt kilowatt charger, and only 1 in 5 is working. And I think, so what can the Scottish Government do to ensure that there is, when you are taking your £12,000 electric vehicle from Perth to Inverness on the A9, because you'll not get there in one go, you'll need to pull over at Pitlochry, that every single charger is going to be working when you pitch up there, or are you going to have to wait an hour before you can get on?
So you will know, as I've just said in my previous answer, it's the UK government that's responsible for the regulations for charging infrastructure, and their new regulations would penalise those providers, whether it's local authorities, whether it's private sector, if there isn't the delivery level that is required. So that should move, that should move the change in terms of performance of UK charging structures. I think that was the right thing to do. I think doing it as a sledgehammer and doing it as a cliff edge immediately, that you were going to get fined £15,000 a pop. I'm not quite sure how much it is for not delivery. We do monitor. That's something we have done through the Charge Place Scotland, which is again, in terms of that's transitioning to other forms of delivery, but the rates of performance of that are high, although in the past, and everybody only takes one experience to be a bad experience, then it knocks people's confidence. I understand that, but you should have confidence that the Conservative UK government's regulations on the charge place structure should actually help with that enforcement.
As a second EV owner, I have had many poor charging experiences, I can assure you, in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before we close this section, Cabinet Secretary, I think the draft plan went out for consultation at the beginning of November. My understanding is the consultation closed on the 29th of January, or thereby. And we'd written as a committee to the Cabinet Secretary for Climate Change to ask what was going on, if she could keep the committee updated. So here's your opportunity. I'm sure you will have been following the consultation very carefully when it comes to transport. Are there any key things that you've seen coming back from the public consultation that you'll want to reflect on when the climate change plan moves from draft to full?
So nice move, but I think a bit challenging. And obviously, over the weekend, I have not had the results of the transport elements of the consultation. I will take a keen interest, and I will come back to the committee. Obviously, we'll share what the transport aspects are. But I would like to be able to do that, but I think it's perhaps unfair. In my preparation for this committee, I have not been delving into the responses that have not been presented to me yet on the transport aspects. But I think Gillian Martin, who I think you're seeing next week, the Cabinet Secretary for Climate Change, will be able to go through what's next in terms of the process.
I think the point is that in the same way that you would be rushed from the ends of that consultation, this committee is going to be rushed in looking at all those consultation responses. I don't even know how many there are. Maybe Philip knows how many there are. Are there lots?
Don't have the exact number, but we are very taken with the enthusiasm of responses that came in, particularly towards the end of the consultation. So can I suggest that the Ms. Martin, Cabinet Secretary for CAE, picks that up next week and gives an update on the consultation responses?
That would be extremely helpful, because I think it's useful to know from the committee's point of view what the responses are and what they are, so we can consider them in the same way the government is when we write the report for the Parliament that we'll be writing. So, Cabinet Secretary, thank you very much for that session. You're not off the hook yet. There's a small pause. Can I say that we'll meet back here at 10:55, and so I'm going to suspend the meeting to allow a changeover of witnesses. Thank you.